So black people are worshiping their slave traders. And it is not the white man. Who is it? It's the Muslims. It's so ridiculous. All these like pan African movements and these black power movements are trying to get everyone to go to the faith of Islam, right? But those are the very people who kidnapped blacks and sold them in the transatlantic slave trade, right? The Arabs came over, and as early as 639 was when the first Arabs got to Africa. 4 years later after that, they took over Egypt, and 9 years after that, in 652, they started enslaving Africans. So if you're going to all black power movements, Pan-African movements and stuff, and they're cheating, oh yeah, the devil's the white man. Okay, yeah, are there any bad white people as there are Africans, right? A lot of Africans sold other Africans into slaves, but the thing that initiated the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted for about 400 years, right, was the Arabs initially there since the 600s all the way for 14 centuries, enslaving, brutalizing, killing Africans. And if you look, it's actually Christianity, that now that these leftists and woke people are trying to say, is the enslaver of the black man, is actually what invokes freedom, right? To say liberty, to proclaim liberty throughout all the nation, right? What's written on the Liberty Bell. Because in the Bible, it's taught that if any man kidnaps another man for the purpose of slavery, then he should be put to death. But it's in the hadiths, right? It's okay. I'm not trying to say like all Muslims are evil, but there's some, they just want to do the thing, pray all the time, and they're in communion with God. That's good. But there's also the hadith. These people believe in killing the unbeliever and attacking their land, which is exactly what they did in Africa, and for their women and children to enslave them. In the 19th century, for instance, when the Arabs were there, they put 2 million people in slaves, and another 8 million who wouldn't become slaves were killed before that. Going up to a total of, after that, of like, what was it, 12 million people were sold. The black people who were kidnapped in Africa by Arabs, by some Africans, to America. About 12 million, maybe another million or so died on the way, right? And like the thing, and of course most of them went to Central, South Africa, Haiti, the Caribbean, so on, right? About 5% came to what is known as America, and that doesn't even touch a dent to the trans-Saharan and the East African trading of slaves, of reaching of 140 million people in conservative estimates, for the Arabs enslaving the blacks in Africa. It's so synonymous to their culture of what they did to Africa that even the word abid in Arabic, that slave, is also the same word for black. That's what they just go. If they saw a black person, they just say abid, right? It's even synonymous within the language of how they saw them. And if you look right, that's also in East Africa, right? The last to actually abolish slavery, but then they didn't really abolish it either. I mean, slavery's still practiced there, and especially in the Muslim world. And so, like, all these black people had their history stolen, so they're turned to just, oh yeah, you should hate the white man, you should hate the white man, and you're tearing down your own culture. But if you look, why don't the Arabs ever have that culture? They're a lot more cunning, they're a lot more devious, in that they don't have the books, right? If you look at the European slave trade, they made, you know, there you could look at the notes, like, sure, it's still gonna be slanted, but at least the records are there. Where with the Arab records, even if you do find the records, they're not gonna have everything there. But it's not. That's why, you know, this whole movement of you trying to erase history, trying to take down statues, what it's doing is you're eliminating what we've overcome as a people, which is exactly the opposite of what it tells us in Exodus, right? If you look, like, the Jews are always remember what God did for us. Remember what God did for us. God freed our people out of slavery. He did it in Egypt. He did it again in America, right? Both were about 400 years of slavery there in Egypt, about 400 years of slavery for the transatlantic trade. And that history should be remembered. If you tear down these statues of what we overcame, then you're gonna let it go for it to be repeated by some other dictator, you know, as it went time and time again throughout all of history. And, you know, you're by tearing down the history, you're completely disrespecting what our ancestors have went through. You're saying that it shouldn't be remembered. Remember the Passover, remember the Passover, remember the Passover. Every year in Nissan, right? Like, it tells us again and again all throughout Exodus to remember what God did for us. Because the moment you forget it, what's left? Because it doesn't stop there, does it? Now to the point, it doesn't matter if it's a historical figure, it's just someone who they think they don't like. No matter what they did to have the progress of what actually freed our people. It's just something to think about. Like, you're so blinded by hate of course, a very gruesome, one of the worst tragedies throughout all of history. But don't let that blind you to then go to then where you could be taken over back. Look when these leftist institutions do, they're always pushing, you know, these Muslim ideas, because it's such a weakness to infiltrate freedom. You know, it's so easy for that, because it's just, oh, accepting, we're liberating, yeah, everything's the same, Muslims the same. No, Muslims enslaved you, and yet you're running to them instead of the very religion, the very thing, Christ, which freed you. And you want to blame that as a white man's religion when Christ came from Israel. And that's where he freed us and freed his people. And he did it again for us in America. And it's just so ungrateful to tear down the history of our ancestors like that. Stop running to your oppressors.